Hi there. I'm Steve Curwood, host of Living on Earth's uh, latest virtual event. Thanks for joining us tonight. You know, we we started this authors series back when people actually could get together safely in auditoria before the virus was upon us. Um, but this online way of being in touch with you and doing things live, so you can have a conversation with us as well as hearing us, um, is terrific. Um, Living on Earth, of course, is a nationally syndicated public radio show. We cover environmental change, ecology, human health. Of course, these days we focus especially on climate disruption and obviously the whole ecology of how human health and the smallest creatures we can't even see affect us. Living on Earth is also a podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, many other streaming services. So if you want to listen to this again, or indeed listen to any of our programs, just go right online and click in, and you can actually. We've been doing the show since weekly since 1991, and you can find many of our archives right there uh, on our website. So hopefully you enjoy what you hear tonight, and if it prompts your curiosity to hear other things, just go check us out. So, as I said, we've been having a series of lectures with authors in a series we call Good Reads on Earth. And uh, tonight, we're in for a terrific treat. You saw, perhaps if you logged in first, the banner for Carl Safina's new book here. Uh, this book is called Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. Now, if you don't know Carl Safina, let me tell you a little bit about him. Um, Carl is one of the most gifted storytellers I know, and his first book, Song for a Blue Ocean, put him in perhaps the category of being a marine biologist. But then he's gone on to do things. Most recent book was Beyond Words, and so I'm not sure if he's a biologist or a philosopher or both. Um, Carl's work has been recognized a number of different ways. He's MacArthur Fellowship, he's won Pew, Guggenheim for fellowships. He's won a number of prestigious literary honors, including from Orion Magazine. And he's on the line now. Carl, so where are you? You're in New York, you're out there on Long Island?
I am here on Long Island, yes.
And of course, that suits you well because most of Long Island is not too far to the ocean for you,
No, that's why I'm still here. I
huh?
was actually out on the ocean last evening, and this morning I was in the water. I went to get some clams.
Uh-huh. Are they in your tummy now?
Not yet, but after we're done with this, we're going to have quite a nice cookout in my backyard.
So, uh, as Carl and I talk, take a few notes because if you want to ask questions a little later in the session, you can. There's a place that you can use the Zoom Q&A function if you're following us on Facebook Live. There's also a place there to post your questions. So, with all of that, Carl, I officially should say, welcome to Living on Earth.
Well, thank you. It's great to see you as always. We don't get to do this very often.
Not often enough. Um, but of course, you're already writing another book, so I imagine, if nothing else, I'll see you about that fairly soon.
You probably will.
So let's cut to the chase. Carl, what is culture?
Well, if you ask many people, you get many different definitions. There are, well, as I was researching this book, I looked at various published definitions of culture in the academic literature. Some of them were pretty interesting and pretty helpful. Some of them were distinctly bad and not helpful. For instance, the worst one was culture is anything humans do. Well, humans sneeze, humans sleep, humans get the cold. They do a lot of things that are not culture. Humans eat. Eating is not culture, but what we eat and how we eat starts to get to be culture. So what I learned from considering culture from a lot of different perspectives is that it's not just what humans do. And it's not just the things where you say to people, what do you think culture is? And they'll say, oh, it's jazz and opera and ballet, or they'll say, well, it's technology. Well, those things are culture, but that's not what culture is. Culture is the behaviors, the habits, and even the attractions that we learn socially and that are transmitted socially. So we live in our culture. We don't live in the culture of hunter gatherers in the Amazon who don't have jazz and ballet and computers and things like that. We don't live in an Arctic hunting and fishing culture. We live in our culture, and many other kinds of animals live in their cultures as well. The amazing thing to me is that whether it's human, modern, Western technological culture, or whether it's sperm whales, culture basically does the same things for social beings. It, 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 it functions in very similar ways, although the manifestations of it are completely different.
So I think what's so fascinating about this book, and maybe this is the point, um, animals have culture. I mean, you've been talking in your previous works about consciousness that animals have, but here you have picked some examples to show that animals have culture. Why do that?
Why do that? Well, because I think that, I mean, your show is called Living on Earth, and it's kind of good to know who we're living with on Earth. So that's why I'm trying to figure out who we are by knowing who we're with, and that informs everything about life. It gives us perspective. Where do we come from? How are we compared to other living things? How are they compared to us? What are the overlaps? What are the similarities? And I find it both really intellectually fascinating, also emotionally astonishing, and very beautiful a lot of the time.
So, so why study animal culture? I mean, to what extent does this give you insight into human culture?
Humans are animals, and so we have culture for exactly the way that other animals who have culture have culture. Not all other animals have culture. To have culture, you need to live in social groups, and you need to live in social groups that are stable social groups where individuals mean something to other individuals. One aspect of culture is that you know who you are because you know who you're with. That's an aspect of culture that other animals that have culture share with humans. We don't understand who we are as completely separate individuals just among a lot of other people. We understand who we are relative to other people, and who we are and how we are is determined by who they are and how they are. That's how we understand our identity. Our identity is largely a group identity. You say, "Who are you?" You would say, you would start partly by listing some groups you belong to.
Okay.
I'm an American. I'm a male. I'm a member of a certain faith. I'm a devotee of a certain musical group or musical genre. I'm a fan of a certain team. That starts to constitute really who you are. It's your perspective in your um, in your society, and that's the same for other animals that have culture. It helps us it gives us a group identity, and that helps us understand who we are. That's one of the first things it does.
So, a spoiler alert, and I'll try not to tell too much, because this book is a lot of fun, Carl. It's very provocative. And in fact, if somebody's watching us thinking, hey, maybe I should find something that will really help me think about things in a wonderfully an enlightening, critical way, as we these days seem to spend a lot of time at home or in one place. This is a delight, and of course, you could even put together an online book group to discuss this group because there's so much in it. So without tipping uh, too many of your aha moments, and believe you me, there are a lot of aha moments in this volume. Let me ask the question this way. So if uh, so what animals have things like, say, favorite baseball teams and music, and whether or not maybe they wear Michael Jordans or wingtips? I mean, what do we see of that in the world of animal culture that you've studied doing this work?
Yeah, well, I would say respectfully, I think that's exactly, you just fell right into the gigantic pit trap of how to approach this subject from the most hazardous end,
Oh, you
which
mean
is
the human end? The human end, is that the problem?
to take the human answer sheet and see how other animals score on our test. We have our culture, they have their culture. So those details vary almost completely. But what culture does for us and does for a society is where you find the most overlap. You find the overlapping parts of how it functions. So in a way, I'll answer your question directly. You're talking about very specific things, and those specific things are part of how a cultural group, and humans have many different cultural groups, and we are members of numerous cultural groups at once, which is a bit different about us compared to other animals. But what it does is it helps give us an identity that answers the following question. This is really what culture does across the board for all species. It answers a question of how do we live here where we live? So if we like certain kinds of shoes, that's part of our culture. But with other animals, it's things like where, what constitutes food for us in this region? Where do we go in the winter when things start to get, harsh? Where is our winter range? What predators do we need to be aware of and be afraid of? Um, and because the things that you were talking about, specific kinds of shoes or specific teams or things like that, those are ways that humans specialize within their culture. This is a major aspect of culture across all species, is that culture is really based on specialized ways of doing things, and those specialized ways vary from one cultural group to the next. So, for instance, you have sperm whale clans that one clan hunts and travels in a certain pattern. Another clan that may swim through the same waters, they hunt and travel with a different pattern. Chimpanzees, you probably know that chimpanzees make tools out of sticks and things like that. But there are chimpanzees that make no tools out of sticks. There are chimpanzees that use stone tools. There are a lot of different kinds of things within chimpanzee cultures, but they vary from place to place, which is one of the main reasons that we know that it's cultural. Birds often sing with a local dialect. If you move them to a different place and they start trying to court using the dialect from where they're from, well, that is not the favorite song of the place that you've just experimentally moved them to. And their courtship will not find any engagement among the females there who are listening and looking for suitable males. It's a weird song to them. So, humans have a kind of similar thing. We listen to music from other cultures. We tend to like our own the most. We identify with our own the most. And so the details are really totally different, but how it functions is really remarkably similar.
So what I've been kind of speaking around is this whole notion of how do animals and us, how do we do certain things, um, particularly looking at adaptation and natural selection. Carl, so to what extent are animals really learning new things within their lifetimes, or some would say simply acting out what's in their genes, maybe in their epigenetics as well?
Yeah, well, how do we know that they're learning things? The way we know that they're learning things is if you take an animal that is raised in captivity, you think of a chimpanzee or a parrot or something like that, raised in captivity, you just open the door. Even if you take them into native habitat and you just open the door, they're basically doomed. A chimpanzee will simply die because it needs to learn everything, just like we would die if somebody took us to the Amazon and dropped us off by the side of the road and sped away, or the Arctic, or places where if we were there as children, we would naturally simply learn everything we need to know about easily living in those places. Every situation that came up, we would know the answer to that situation. We
But
would have
wait,
learned it from our elders.
that's
And
good.
that's
Yes, from
and
elders. So
that's
not
and that's what
okay.
happens. Now, the thing that you said about how do we know it's not just genes, there's an interplay between genes and culture. Genes give you the capacity for what kind of culture you can learn. So humans have one of our most distinguishing capacities is we have a genetically endowed capacity to learn a human type language. But whether that language is French or Vietnamese or Swahili is entirely cultural. So that's part of the interplay. You can hear my dogs bark. That's part of the interplay between culture and genes. So genes capacitate for the kinds of culture that you can learn. We have hands, that's genetic. We do a lot with our hands. Orca whales don't have hands. Their culture doesn't involve manipulating objects. So there are limitations or I guess in a way predictions about what kind of culture you can move toward depending on your genetic makeup. But the culture is what you learn on top of your genes. And culture itself can evolve and pivot and adapt and adjust much faster than genes. And it can create a pressure then for genes to need to catch up to what specialization you have begun. For instance, I mentioned orca whales. They have fish eating groups and mammal eating groups. And as far as going back to what I said about we understand how we live here depending on our culture. So the fish eating culture of the orca whales, they travel around in big groups. They're noisy. It pays to scare fish into dense groups because you can catch them easier that way. You find them by blasting your sonar all over the place to look for them. If you're hunting mammals, you need to do exactly the opposite. You have to be silent, basically, very sneaky. You need to be in very small groups because mammals have really good hearing. They can hear your sonar really well. They can move really fast because they're hot-blooded. So if you took mammal hunting whales and fish-eating whales and you mix them together, it would be chaos. They would blow it for each other. And so they don't mix together. Their specialization causes them to sort of move into their cultures deeper. And if you're hunting mammals and you're an orca whale, mammals are dangerous. A big sea lion is a dangerous thing. A salmon is not a dangerous catch. 20-pound salmon is not going to hurt you. A 1,000-pound stellar sea lion can hurt you. So after you have this culture of catching mammals, there's a pressure for your genes to catch up and give you bigger teeth, bigger jaws, stronger jaws. And that is exactly what we see. And the other thing that we see is that those two types have not interbred for several 100,000 years. The usual definition of species is you can interbreed freely when you meet an individual of your own species. They don't do that. So the culture has made them segregate and start evolving into a deeper specialization, each of them, that has gotten them along a different evolutionary path. And this is the kind of effect of culture that I think has been totally overlooked basically until now.
So, oh, by the way, you had company there with your dogs. We're going to talk about culture in sperm whales and those brilliantly colored macaws and chimps. But First, from your own observations as a human, as a pet guardian, and as a biologist, what do you see in terms of dog culture in your own household?
Well, two things really is that every household has a certain kind of culture that dogs pick up on, and if it's if it's a house and if it's a home where the dogs can live easily and get to be dogs, instead of a place where they're too cramped up or too small an apartment, or the people and the dogs don't understand each other very well. Um, but if they do understand each other well and the dogs have room to move along and make their own decisions, they quickly learn what the culture is. And it's in all sorts of little ways. How they tell you when they want to go outside. Some of that is self-invented, but then it becomes something that you both understand what the message is. In our house, we often take our dogs to different places in the car. If I touch my car keys, they just come running and jumping all over the place. They want to make sure that I see them. They want to make sure that I know that they want to come with me. And that's part of the culture, and that's part of the culture that they basically invented their response to. The littlest one, who is she's about 6 years younger than the other two, she patterned herself very strongly on she's a female, and she patterned herself very strongly on the other females. She just would follow her around, do everything she did. She was learning culture exactly the way you learn culture, by watching how your elders function in your culture. In our house, if we go to the door and we say, okay, come on, oh, there's all kinds of excitement. But if we simply say goodbye, it totally stops instantly. The tails go down, they go lie down. That's all that needs to be said. They understand our culture. But if you brought a different dog in, they wouldn't have any idea what we were doing. Car keys would mean nothing to them. Goodbye would mean nothing to them. So you see it really easily in dogs.
You have an anecdote in your book. You talk about when you got your youngest dog, one dog stepping up to both employ some dog culture and also do a bit of teaching. Can you tell that story now?
Yeah. I think it's the one where we were on the beach and I was trying to get the little one to just have to follow us. Is that the one? So,
Yes.
yeah. So I usually think that if you want a dog to follow you, you need to be walking away from it. So it knows that it's supposed to follow you. And if you just wait for it all the time, it is teaching you that it doesn't, it can do anything it wants because it knows that you will simply always be there. So there has to be a little give and take on that. You be patient, but if you need to go, you need to go. And that's the signal that they need to follow. So I think it was the second day that we had this new young puppy. We went to the beach, the three dogs, my wife and myself, and we decided, okay, let's let her off the leash. I think she's oriented well enough on us that I think it's safe to let her off the leash. We let her off the leash. We went for a long walk down the beach, and then we turned around, and we turned around, and they all started following us because she was taking her cues partly from us, partly from the other dogs. Got about halfway there, and she decided to run off after another dog that appeared on the beach. And I just said, let's just keep walking. She has to know that if she's not paying attention, we're not going to be where she left us. She's got to focus on us and pay attention. So we all stay together as a group. Well, one of our dogs reluctantly started following us, and the other one stopped. And he turned around and he faced her, and I called him, and he just lay down with his butt end facing me and his face end facing her. And he was showing us she is now part of our family and our culture, and I'm not going to leave unless I know that she's with us. So he didn't like my brand of tough love in that situation, and he taught me a kinder, gentler way that was his preferred alternative. And that was very, very interesting to see, what he was thinking and how he was thinking about it. Up until that day, he would simply follow us. Now there was somebody else involved, and that completely changed his reaction.
Part of the family.
Yeah.
So you open your book down off of Dominica in the Caribbean, not too far from Guadeloupe or Martinique, if people are familiar with that part of the world. Um, I guess what's really cool about that area is that these are volcanic mountains that really just erupt from the ocean floor. How many feet down would you say, Carl?
Oh, I really don't know exactly how far they plunge, but very, very close to shore, within just 2 or 3 miles, it's several thousand feet deep. Whereas, for instance, in New York, you can go 75 miles and it's only 600 feet deep where it starts to drop off. Before it starts to drop, you could go 70 or 65 miles, it's still only 300 feet deep. So the difference between that, where there's a flat continental shelf, and these volcanic islands that just come out of the deep ocean thousands of feet deep, is very, very dramatic. And that's why we were there, because sperm whales live in very deep ocean, but there you can study them from shore, because a few miles from shore, you're in very deep ocean.
And so you spend a fair amount of time studying sperm whales, and uh, you talk about them in terms of having a culture. What are the elements of that culture, and how do they communicate?
Well, yes, basically, one of the most surprising things about sperm whales is that their social organization is almost exactly like elephants. They live in female-led families where the matriarch, it's not really called matriarch in sperm whales, but anyway, it's the same thing. It's the oldest female. She may be with her younger sisters and their daughters and their children. When the males get to adolescence, just like with elephants, they go off, they have a different male kind of a social structure. But these family groups are female. And why is that? It's similar reasons in both situations, is that they have um, need to protect very helpless babies as a group. Now, with the sperm whales, their food is maybe 3,000 feet from the surface. There's no light at all. There's very cold temperatures. They hunt entirely by using sonar. They make these clicks about 2 per second, and they hunt for squid that way in the dark using sonar. And they're down for about 50 minutes at a time, and then they come up for about 10 or 12 minutes. The babies cannot go down there. And left at the surface, they're totally helpless. So if any orcas, killer whales show up, or any sometimes pilot whales or false killer whales like to harass them, they're totally helpless. So they need somebody to keep an eye on them. And that would be, if their mother is down looking for food, one of their aunts or possibly an older sister would be babysitting for them. At the slightest sign of any trouble, she will call and they will all come rocketing up from the depths. As somebody said, when there's any trouble, sperm whales seem to come out of nowhere. And they call other groups of sperm whales that may come from as far as 7 miles away, coming toward the danger, looking as a group to protect the most vulnerable and to protect each other from dangerous attack. They communicate with clicks. And when they're hunting, the clicks are, as I said, about 2 per second. When they're at the surface or coming near the surface, they change these to patterns of clicks that sound like simple Morse code. And in fact, they're called codas by the scientists. And what they say at the very minimum, maybe they say some other things, but at the very minimum, they say who they are as an individual. They announce who they are. They announce what family they are with, and they announce what clan their family belongs to. Families within a clan can socialize, but families of different clans avoid one another. So that's how they say it, and that's what they say.
So it's as if same species, but they consider themselves culturally differentiated the way that people who speak French exclusively see themselves as different from people who speak, say, Japanese.
Yes, and that's because of their. If you're in the same group, you understand each other, just like if you speak the same language, you understand each other. But if you try to do something with somebody from a totally different culture or a different language, there will be a lot of things you don't understand, and there'll be a lot of things that are confusing. So it's very hard to cooperate. One of the reasons to have culture is that everybody has the same expectations. You know how to cooperate. You know what you're saying when you're saying it in human culture. But if you're a Westerner in an Asian culture, you're not looking around for the knife and the fork and the spoon, because you understand that we use chopsticks in an Asian culture. At least you understand that. But if you didn't understand that, you would be at a loss about, how are we going to eat here? I don't see my knife and fork and my spoon. Or you go to shake hands and the other person goes to bow, and then you're confused about what's going on and what signals are being sent. Why is this person thrusting their hand at me? Why is this person bowing? You have to know that in order to cooperate. Humans nowadays, we have a great need to understand other cultures so that we can cooperate, because for the first time in history, we are jumbling ourselves together. It's creating a lot of problems, and we need to get beyond those problems and learn how to get along and learn how to function together. But for most of the history of life on Earth, including most human history, if you are in a culture, it doesn't really pay for you to try to spend time figuring out what those other ones are doing, because your group does things in a way that works for you and for the group. So you don't need to look any further. Nowadays, we have that need, but generally, it hasn't been that way.
Oh, so in other words, nowadays we have culture wars as a function of this amalgamation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with other animals and their cultures is that culture, one of the fundamental things is culture causes individuals to clump together and form a group, but it causes groups to avoid each other, repel each other, or act hostile with one another. And so why would we bother having culture wars? Because as animals, we are uncomfortable with groups of individuals that belong to a different culture within our own species. Even though if we were raised in that other culture, we would just be exactly part of that culture, just like them. We would be them. So we're grappling with our animal impulses in ways that we don't understand. We don't understand why it is that we learn and we teach each other to look down on or be hostile to other cultures. And it's because in evolutionary time, humans and where we got our cultural tendency from before humans, it pays to do what works, and it's safe to not do what you don't know. If you see others that are doing something you don't know, it's just safer to just avoid that, because you're not sure what will happen. You may get confused. You may do things that don't work for you. So we're in a very, very different time where culture is both how we live, and it's also how we don't get along in many cases.
And you talk about that, about violence among the primates, and your section of the book about chimpanzees. But before we go there, Carl, let me ask you this. So if the sperm whales live together in a tight culture, just in their family group, certainly no wider circle than their clan, what happens to genetic diversity for them?
Right. Well, I should say that since all of these things are a little different, sperm whale clans are big. They may contain thousands of whales, and humans can tell if a perfect stranger, somebody they've never seen before, is a member of their group. We can tell by the language or by a religious symbol or by a team insignia or something like that. The only other creature that can tell if a perfect stranger is a member of their group is sperm whale. The only other species known, and sperm whale clans can be very, very big. So I'm sorry, what was the question you were actually trying to get at?
The question I was getting at is, you'd like some genetic diversity over time
Oh,
to not
yes,
become
okay, genetic
inbred.
diversity, right. Well, that varies as well. With the sperm whales, what happens is the males leave and they go for a number of years to high latitudes, while the females stay mostly in the tropics and subtropics. The males go to places that can be very cold, and then they come down and they look for groups of females and they mate. So the males keep the gene pool mixed, and that's why the sperm whale culture is purely cultural, has no genetic component. But the orca whales I was talking about, for instance, they do not have roving males. Their males stay within what's called their community, which is kind of like a smaller, much smaller clan that may have a few hundred individuals. And the males will not leave that community. And that's why with them, you do get genetic differentiation, so that the fish-eating ones are a little different than the mammal-eating ones in terms of the size of their teeth and the strength of their jaws. With orca whales around the world, there are probably 10 different, what they call them types, but when the genetic evaluations are all done, I think we will find that they really are different species, because they are genetically differentiated as a result of this cultural divergence and self-segregation. One scientist said that orca whales are the most self-segregated species other than humans.
So, in all this work studying sperm whales, that sounds like a challenging environment where if you're offshore, it's several thousand feet down. What sort of intelligence did you observe in these whales? What surprised you?
I think what surprised me was how very mammalian they are. You know, they don't have hands, they don't have any rear appendage at all. They have front flippers. They have this gigantic head that's a third of their body length, which is a sound amplifying boombox. It makes them able to emit the loudest sound made by any living thing. So they're very odd looking compared to us. They have, they have basically a fish shape. They live in the ocean. But when they get together, they're very mammalian. They like caressing each other. They extend their flippers and rub their flippers along each other. They roll around together. They appear to be very happy to be together when they get together, which is, as I said, usually they go down for most of an hour and then they come back. They meet whoever is babysitting the young one, and it's a greeting time. Sometimes they just chill and they seem relaxed. They seem pleased to be with one another, and they seem excited to rejoin one another as they're coming up. These codas intensify. One scientist witnessed a birth and said that at the moment of birth, there was a loud blast of codas from the other whales that were present for the birth. So I think that was the most surprising thing about them.
Carl, what did the era of whale hunting do then to these families of sperm whales?
Well, other than the fact that it was basically genocidal, they reacted in a very amazing way. Now, this was not well. It was before scientists understood much about how they form families, and the families belong to the clans, or they announce themselves. In fact, for most of the days of whale hunting, people thought that sperm whales were totally silent. They didn't know that the clicks they heard were coming from them. But usually, and when people first started hunting whales, sperm whales lived generally in family groups or in loose affiliations of families. So you might have 10 or 12 whales in a family. Maybe at times, if there were a few families together, you might have, 30 whales or something like that. After just a few decades of whaling, by the time Herman Melville went whaling in the early 1800s, the sperm whales had joined up into gigantic groups for basically self-defense, for safety in numbers, which meant that the whalers would spend weeks not finding any, and then suddenly coming upon hundreds at a time. This was not the way it was just a few decades earlier, when they started hunting the whales. Then much later on, most of the whales were killed actually in the 20th century after ships had engines and were being run, burning petroleum in internal combustion engines. And then later on in the 60s, they started hunting them even with airplanes communicating to the ships. So it was a massive, massive slaughter, and we came very close to losing entire species of whales. In fact, we lost entire populations from several species in several regions, and the gray whale went extinct in the Atlantic Ocean, for instance. So it was a horrendous time. Millions of whales were killed, and not for any good reasons at that point, especially. But they did socially respond to this pressure in ways that were noted.
Yeah, I think at times they fought back.
At times they fought back, very rarely. There were, when the ships were still made of wood and were still sailing, there were 3 or 4 whales that came out of pods that were under attack and sank the main ship. In other words, the ship would lower these boats that would be rowed to where the whales are, and then they would throw the harpoons in the whales. But on several occasions, a large male whale came out of those groups and attacked the main ship. It understood where these little boats were coming from and sank several ships, but only when they were being under assault in those hot moments.
So that was the change in the culture. Usually the males, the guys would be off someplace, except I guess at mating time, but under the duress of hunting, they came to protect the young and the females. Huh?
It appears that way, or even if they were there just for mating, they understood what was going on, they didn't like it, and they took action, which we would call heroism or compassion. I mean, we would have words for that if it was a person who did the exact same thing.
So clearly whales have families. Now you have another section in your book that you devote to beauty. And I have to ask you the tough question, and this makes me wonder whether you're a biologist or a philosopher or both. So what is beauty? And for that matter, what is love?
Okay. Well, we'll take the easy one first.
Okay.
And I will say, what is philosophy? Philosophy is supposed to be a way of telling you how we can best live, and you can know how we can best live if you understand facts around you about how the world is. So I'm a biologist to try to understand the world, and then I'm trying to understand, well, based on what we know, how can we best live? But what love is a feeling. We all would say love is a feeling and emotion. And how do we manifest that emotion? It feels like a desire to be close to somebody. When you love somebody, you want to be near them. You can see this in some non-human animals that have love in their kinds of social groups that they live in. They want to be near the ones that they know. They call for each other. They come together, and they know each other very well. With our dogs, getting back to dogs are instructive because they're usually the only animals we get to watch as much as we watch them, get to see them really live their lives. We have, for instance, these 3 dogs. They have never been fed anything at all upstairs. And yet every night when we go to sleep, they have their dog beds on the floor, and they come upstairs and they sleep near us in the same room because they like to be near us. When we're sitting on the couch and we don't have any treats or anything like that, they come and they like to be near us. That's love. They show it with their affection, and they show it with their behavior. And I think it's a very similar feeling for them as it is for us, I believe, because they show it in very similar ways. So beauty, what is beauty? Well, beauty, I'll tell you what beauty is not. Beauty is not a property of anything. It's a perception that is created by a brain, a mind. A mind creates a perception of beauty. Intrinsically, a flower is part of a plant and the roots are part of a plant, but our mind tells us that the flower is beautiful and the scent of the flower is beautiful. It doesn't tell us that the roots are very beautiful. This is a very interesting thing about beauty. And we can go from there. So I don't know if you want to ask me any more questions about that, or
Well, just what did the macaw teach you about beauty?
yeah. So what's really amazing is that a lot of the beauty we see is actually created by choices that animals make. Flowers look the way they do because they need to attract pollinators. They signal to pollinators to come and pollinate them. The many birds, the males are the colorful ones and the females are the camouflage ones. The males are colorful because females choose the color. They like the color. They like it for reasons that are kind of arbitrary. That's why the coloration and the patterns and the markings differ so much from one species to the next. They're kind of arbitrary, but they are being chosen based on an aesthetic of sorts. With the macaws are really big parrots. They are big parrots of the New World, the biggest parrots that are in the New World, and probably with the long tails they have, I think they'd measure out to be the biggest parrots in the world. And there are a few species of them, and they are very, very colorful, and males and females are very colorful. But all the rest of the parrots of the New World, there are dozens of species, they're basically green and camouflaged, but they're small. They have a lot to worry about. There are lots of hawks and falcons and things that would like to eat them. So being camouflaged is good. And yet the macaws, for some reasons, they evolved size that helped them to escape the predation of most hawks and falcons and other predators because they're just simply too big for them. And in them, you see this explosion of color, this tropical fruit punch coloration that many of them have. I was with scarlet macaws and blue and gold macaws and red and green macaws, and they're just absolutely spectacular. In them, both sexes look the same. So both sexes are choosing these spectacular colors. They, you might say, to extremely simplify evolutionary history, they found it a bit boring to just be green when they didn't have to worry so much about being camouflaged, and they kept choosing more colorful individuals. So beauty is largely a result of the choice of living things, and I think that is astonishing.
Beauty is a choice.
Life chooses beauty, and by choosing beauty, life creates beauty on Earth.
So another theme of your book, part of your subtitle, is about peace. And I'm just wondering, Carl, if you'd be willing to share a reading starting from that last full paragraph of page 272 of your book.
Okay. Well, I didn't have that queued up, so let me find that. This will take a moment. What page did you say? 272?
272. In the edition that I have, hopefully it's the same that
should be the same. I just passed it. Hang on a second, getting close.
It begins when we stop viewing.
I would have gone right to it if I had thought to ask you, how does it start? Okay, 272. Would you like me to read just the paragraph or from there to the end of the chapter? It's two paragraphs.
Just from there to the end of the chapter would be great.
When we stop viewing the apes and parrots and dolphins as, quote, models of primitive human origins, when we remove our human blinders, we can see that other beings on Earth take an interest in their lives and understand something about who they are, where they are, who they're with, and what they're doing. In their shared experience, they sow and reap their own cultures. Who we are voyaging with on this lonely living planet is quite possibly the only meaningful line of inquiry. I knew that Kat was Kat Hobater, the scientist I was with. I knew that Kat and I would get along when she said, quote, "I haven't come to work in a remote Ugandan forest because I'm interested in clues to human evolution or how we became tool makers. I'm here because I'm interested in chimps."
Indeed. So, what can we learn from well, in this case, the West African chimpanzee culture? What's going on in the minds of some of our closest relatives, do you think?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that in the East African chimpanzee communities, they're very male dominated. The males win their rank in usually by fighting. It's not a peaceful succession as it is in most female-led societies of other species. If the females lead, they become leaders by simply being the eldest, and they're respected for that. But with chimpanzees, the males fight for rank. The most dominant one is always a male. And in East Africa, there's a lot of dust-ups. There's a lot of contests. There's a lot of tension in the air a lot of the time. Um, the males are always looking for, um, they're always calculating where do they stand, do they have a chance now, when can they maybe think about challenging somebody for higher rank. But in West Africa, they don't do that so much. They don't fight very much. Females are have much higher status than they do in East Africa, and that is just a purely cultural thing. It's just the way they do it. And so, you know, what we see, I think, is that here's a species that either makes its life a lot less pleasant than it needs to be, or it makes its life a little more pleasant than it could be. So that's something that we could take a cue from, because we, in my opinion, we are making our lives a lot less pleasant than they need to be in many ways by how we treat each other and how we're always obsessed with our status or whether we're better than other people or who we are better than, those kinds of things. They're totally unnecessary, totally arbitrary, and we would literally get along much better without any of it.
So, what might that teach us about ways that we could achieve peace?
I think it teaches us that most of the unrest and most of the lack of peacefulness that we have is not necessary. It's a cultural artifact. In fact, we learn most of these things culturally, and they don't serve us well at all. They create a lot of human misery, a lot of human strife. They're a great waste of time and energy. And we can see by looking around at other species that we don't have to be that way. We alone are capable of asking how we would like to be, but we alone don't live up to our potential.
To what extent does it say that maybe if more women were in charge, we would be more peaceful?
It kind of makes it go without saying that that seems to be true, because another ape that we are exactly as related to as we are related to chimpanzees is called a bonobo. They weren't even recognized as different species until about 100 years ago. And in their society, the female, the most dominant individual is always a female. They are completely unknown to have any murder in their society. Bonobos have never been known to kill another bonobo. When chimpanzees meet at the border of a community, it's always hostile. They either threaten or sometimes they fight. Sometimes they conduct these ongoing fights that are sometimes called wars. Bonobos, when they meet at the edge of a community, if there's any tension at all, they either just turn around or more famously, they solve the problem by having an orgy. So there are different ways of dealing with strangers, one extreme and another. We could land nicely in the middle of all of that, I think.
So, by the way, if you're watching us now, you can ask some questions. And in fact, I see now there's a question from Ashley who wants to ask you, Carl, if you can hear me. How did you get
I'm
into
listening.
Oh,
I'm
now
listening.
who are we watching here? Who's come onto the
This
screen?
is Katie. This is the one that's been barking a little bit in the background here. She came to the office and she wanted a little extra attention because we usually play at about this time of the night. And this is the youngest of our dogs. This is the one that turned around on the beach and ran to the other dog, and our black dog Jude is the one who sat down and then lay down and insisted on waiting for her. So Katie, would you like to say anything to our studio audience? She says, "Let
Oh,
me down. I'm done."
okay. So, Ashley's asking, how did you get into studying animal behavior, Carl? I'm quoting now. I'm interested in studying wildlife behavior to help advance conservation, particularly for mammals.
Yeah, well, how I got into it, I mean, why I got into it was just that I was completely fascinated by animal behavior. And what animals do is, I would say that, the thing I'm most interested in is what do animals do and why do they do it? That just is totally fascinating to me and has always been. There's no end to what you can learn and the questions you can see and the beauty it gets you into. Um, and how I got into it was um, not very systematically. I kind of wanted to do something with nature for my education and for a job and a career. I didn't have any idea how you do that. I didn't have any guidance about how you do that. I
Wait,
stumbled.
you were missing culture on this.
I was missing culture on that. I stumbled very accidentally into learning about a college program in environmental studies, one of the very first at the time. The only reason I blundered into that was a friend of mine was interviewing at that college. He didn't want to drive there alone, and he asked me if I wanted to take a ride with him. So we got in the car, we drove a couple of hours, and I found out that there was this program that seemed incredible to me. Um, but that was environmental studies, not really animal behavior. The lucky part was that the advisor I was assigned was really interested in animal behavior, so we instantly hit it off. We got along really well. I learned something about studying animal behavior. A professor there that I had during my last semester as a senior was interested in the same thing and introduced me to a woman who became my PhD advisor in graduate school. So I did not have much of a plan. I did not have much good coaching on this. I managed to stumble along into it, but luckily I found my way. So
So
that's how.
I'm wrong to say you didn't have culture. You had your friend who took you to this place. That actually is how culture works.
Well, that is how culture works, but that wasn't the plan of the day. I wasn't going with him to check out the college. I was just going with him because we were simply taking a ride. We were just going to talk during the drive.
And yet here you are.
And yet
Um,
here I am. Right.
so give us a big picture, Carl, before we go here. Uh, so in all the creatures that you've studied, are there any others aside from the dogs that are the best friends of humans?
The best friends of humans. Well, I think it would be better if we asked, is there any other creature that we are their best friends?
Okay. And the answer?
We are not really very compatible anymore with the survival of the rest of life on Earth. Whereas for tens of thousands of years, humans lived with awe and respect for the nature that they were embedded in and had various kinds of spiritual beliefs about that. But we've acquired a power and a hubris that makes us think that we don't really care and we don't really need to care a lot of the time about sweeping things away and viewing them as being in our way. So I think that's the most important thing that we need to know. There are other animals. We have a hard time figuring out whether other animals have minds or can understand us in any way. There are other animals that have no problem understanding that we have minds and we can understand what's going on. You can go on YouTube and see, for instance, a dolphin with a hook in its flipper going over to some divers off Hawaii and basically presenting the flipper with the hook in it and essentially asking, can you take this hook out of my flipper? So one of the divers has a pair of pliers. They start working on this hook. It has to hurt. The dolphin needs to breathe. The people are on scuba. The dolphin breathes, goes to the surface about 40 feet up, takes a breath, comes right back down to the same guy until he's done. The dolphin understands that the people can understand. We have a hard time figuring out that the dolphins also can understand, the elephants can understand, the wolves can understand, and that they have lives that they care about too.
Really impressive. I say that I see that we're just about out of time here, Carl. Before you go, how important is what you're studying? How important is it to study all of this? And what are the lessons that you draw personally from this adventure you've had? And what lessons should we draw as to become better humans?
Well, I think that, the real bottom line for me is we need to leave room for the rest of life on Earth, and that most of the things that we view as beautiful in the world are not human-made things. They're natural things, but we tend to discount that. We say, "Oh, that's mere aesthetics." But imagine life without aesthetics. You would be reduced to just trying to find food and shelter. It's beauty that makes life worth the time and trouble that it takes. And really, because of that, it's beauty that keeps us alive. And I think that's why our minds have evolved the capacity to see beauty so that we can love being in the world. I talked about how living beauty is often beauty that's been chosen because life chooses what's beautiful. But what about a starry night or a sunset, these things that are not capable of responding in any way to our appreciation of them? Why do we appreciate them? Why do we have the capacity to see different wavelengths of light in the sky at the end of the day as beautiful? There's nothing inherently beautiful about it. We see it as beautiful. We see the stars as beautiful, the sound of wind in the trees, beautiful. We have this capacity, I think, because it helps us want to stay alive in the world. Beauty really is in that way almost the most fundamental thing about life. And we are putting a lot of beauty at risk. And I think that a thing is good if it adds beauty and compassion to the world. And I think it's bad if it adds ugliness and pain to the world. So that's what I think I've learned in all of this.
And you study the sperm whales so closely, and you also write that their numbers are diminishing, even as we've stopped hunting them. What do you think is going on? To what extent could this be attributed to all the plastic in the ocean that sometimes looks a lot like squid?
Well, we know that quite a few sperm whales have washed up dead that are packed with plastic that they have mistaken for food. If you've been swimming around in the ocean for 20 or 30 million years, you know what food looks like. And then if suddenly something appears that looks like food, you don't think you need to ask a question about that. So they're dying of that. They're dying of ship strikes. The noise in the ocean makes it harder for them to communicate. There are toxic chemicals building up in them. This is what I mean when I say that we've become really not fully compatible with life on Earth, and that's a bad thing to have on your resume. But it is something that we got here, this way under our own power. We could change things around and honor the thing that I think is best in humans. Of all the animals that have some compassion, we are capable of having the most compassion, and that's the best thing about us. So why not try to engage what's best about us in how we approach life on Earth, living on Earth, one might say, at the end of living on Earth.
um, by the way, so the novelist Douglas Adams famously wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and one of the plot lines in that story is that the Earth is being destroyed to make room for an intergalactic expressway of some kind. And just before impact, the dolphins take off, saying, "So long, and thanks for the fish." And so, but in real life, so far as we know, there aren't any dolphins performing anthropological research on humans. Carl, what does it say about human culture, or at least the part of the human culture that you and I are a part of, that we're out in the world researching these other species?
Well, you know, we didn't do anything like that until maybe the late 1800s. Is that when ethnobiology and anthropology began? You know, Margaret Mead and her mentor. Um, but we are capable of some fantastic things, but we are also capable of some horrible things. And I wish we would just play to the fantastic things about us. I think we would enjoy life much more. We would live in a much more beautiful world. We would have far fewer problems. And it's a pity that we don't play to our best strengths, but we are capable of some really, really interesting things. We're capable of being pretty intelligent, but I think we also see with our behavior that the limits of our behavioral impulses and the limits of our intelligence. We're really a mixed bag.
Carl Safina is the author of Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. Carl, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, I'm always very honored to be with you, and I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate everybody showing up for this. It's been really great and really fun.
So, in fact, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And if you enjoyed our event, do feel free to donate to Living on Earth to help us produce more free content like this. You just go to our website. It's loe.org. There's a donate place at the top of the page. We are listener supported, so any amount would help. And actually, this week, if anyone donates $100 or more and emails us a copy of the receipt, you will get an exclusive signed copy of Carl's new book. How about that? So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.